What are the god tier exercises that produce such an incredible amount of Olympic athletes? And is it even the exercises themselves? Now that's definitely a part of it, but Poliquin describes a few things in his book, The Poliquin Principles, that sort of outline how we can decide which exercise we want to do. So a big thing here is the ratio of strength. So for example, he talked about the hamstrings and the quads, and how in his sprinters, for example, he wanted about a 60-40 dominant, with the hamstring being the more dominant. Now this is because he's arguing they're a huge sort of engine and driver for movement. But even if it wasn't, say, 60-40, I think the general principle here is really good. What is the imbalance here between your muscles? One thing that I thought was really creative in his way to test this was to chuck somebody on like a prone leg curl and just absolutely fatigue them, gas them out, and then see which way their legs start to spin when they get fatigued. For example, he said if the feet start to spin out, the biceps femoris, which is just part of the hamstring group, is too strong, right? So now we need to work on the quads. Now I will come back to the quads in just a moment, but now that we've discussed the hamstrings, let's talk about how best to train them. So he really advocates here for a stiff-legged deadlift and a good morning. He's saying that these are sort of the best exercises for extension, and to work on those hamstrings. Now he did recommend to unilaterally stretch the quads prior to this to increase range of motion, and to focus on the eccentric portion for deceleration, so like if someone's running, to be able to stop really quickly, which is a really key aspect to a lot of sports. Looking at the quad side of things, I made a really interesting observation, which is that during the squat, obviously the quads are very active, but to a varying degree. So quads are just four, I guess you call them individual muscles, but they contribute differently in this exercise. So he's arguing that the medialis portion of the quads is more active in getting you out of the bottom position. And if you've ever done a squat, you know that this is really like the hardest portion of that movement, for most at least. He argues that you should do a 1 1/4 squat. So you're doing like come down and then do a little pulse up, come down, come back up. And also that you should have a slant board under your heels. Apparently these two things will help target the medialis. Just as an aside here, he said that if you have some sort of injury, it's really good to use the safety bar, because it's going to lower the distance between the resistance, the weight, and the center of motion, so you're less susceptible to injury. The last thing on the leg portion of things was he really loved the reverse hyper. This is something that I've had a bit of a confusing relationship with, because I love people like Dr. Stuart McGill, who talk a lot about core stability, and he's not completely against this exercise, but he does call it high risk, and that's definitely the thought in my mind. But essentially what Poliquin argues here is it's great for glute and hamstring activation. And I guess one thing that aligns with McGill is that he recommends a much slower lowering, which would be less aggressive on the spine, so that's good to hear. Okay, moving on to the upper body, right? What does he recommend here? So he says bent rows he's a big fan of, but he doesn't want you to drive with the legs. He really wants you to try and focus on the lats, which makes sense. We're trying to work on the upper body. External rotation. This is obviously a really important part of exercise and sport generally, and I was really glad he listed out a bunch of prompts and cues here, which is very rare when we're talking about external rotation. So blasting through a few of those, he said neutral head, which is great, that's definitely accurate, a neutral wrist, and to really try and elevate the bottom portion of your sternum. You want people working a full range of motion, and very interestingly, he said stretch the pecs and the lats between sets. Kind of makes sense, they're internal rotators, adductors, right? We really want to open up, whereas those muscles really want to close us in. So kind of trying to shut off the antagonist to the movement. But it does make sense. If you look at the external rotators, they're a very small portion of muscles, whereas there's such dominant internal rotators in the body. We need to do a lot of work here to sort of balance things out. And the last thing in this upper body portion was chin-ups. Massive chin-up fan. Right, so he had a lot of different variations that he recommended here, so let's just dive into all of those. For starters, he said if you do shoulder width, you're really targeting your lats and your biceps. If you want to work on the lower lat and the rhomboids, he recommended like the V grip, and if you want the least strain on your joints, at like your shoulder, your elbow, and wrist, to just have the palms facing each other. So that might be the one that I steal. Now in terms of how he said to do this, he said that you want to pull your elbows down and back, not the shoulders, which I thought was an interesting cue. And also that we want to let the shoulders elevate at the bottom, which is sort of the opposite of what I heard. Like Kelly Starrett says, don't just hang on your meat, right? You want to be like fully engaged. But I guess that doesn't necessarily contradict this. You just sort of, you would stay engaged, but just still sort of almost shrug up. So that was interesting to hear. And one thing that he said here around how to progress up if you can't do chin-ups, I hate to say it, but aligned with what my brother's been telling me for years, which is don't do the assisted pull-up machine. He essentially said this just doesn't progress properly. He says you build up from holding both ankles to one ankle to the waist, and then only just helping at the sticking point, and then they can do it on their own. The last variation of the pull-up that I'd never seen before was a subscap pull-up. So the subscapularis is a muscle on the anterior, so front side of your shoulder, but it's rather deep. It's just on the opposite side of the shoulder blade. So he said for this, you want to rise, push back, and then lower. Which is such a strange way of doing it, but I can see how that would target that area, so that's something I definitely want to try and experiment with. And for those of you who don't know, I'm learning all of this as a part of my 50 Days to Rebuild challenge, where I read 50 pages of a physio/exercise book and do 50 minutes of exercise in a day in an attempt to rehab myself, and we're up to day 33. So I'll move on to the exercise portion of things for today. So jumping straight into it, pretty brutal day. I was doing side planks and my knee hurt. And I'll put a clip up here of what I tried to do about this. So it's something I've done for a long time where I'll basically just hold my patella, so my kneecap, and kind of aggressively just kick my leg. And this cracks my knee. Never had this be a problem before, but as you can see here, oh my god, I hurt myself. This did not go away. This was quite the learning experience, not to ever do that again. So that sucked. I spent a lot of today trying to figure out what to do about that. I tried doing the single leg balances where I abduct my other leg. That actually did go quite well, but it still felt quite sore. So, and I guess it didn't feel like the type of motion that I needed in that area. I did try and do like a squat, it hurt. Tried to do a Patrick step, it was kind of good, kind of okay. I thought it got a little better, and then I made the mistake of trying to do a bird dog. Oh my god. Yeah, that was agony for a moment. It did help me realize that it was an extension pain, which makes sense based on how I aggravated it, right? It was rapid extension of my knee. So what I did after that was just really slowly, really patiently trying to build back into that extension range. This hurt a lot when I pushed too far, so I tried to be really patient with it, not simultaneously extending my hip. I definitely really aggravated and put a lot of tension on things. But just trying to slowly push into it and kind of just massaging, moving my patella around, trying to just make sure there's a bit of movement in there. I did get a little bit of range back, which was good. But yeah, don't crack your knee. That's what I learned. That kind of sucked. But anyway, look, that is it for today. That is day 33. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.